So in the last video, we finished talking about whether or not a cell is closer to threshold or it is further away from threshold. And the cell typically starts off at about negative 70 millivolts. And depending on which ligand-gated channel is opened, that will determine whether or not the cell gets closer to threshold, which means whether or not it's depolarized or aka hypopolarized, meaning it's going to be less negative and it's going to get closer to threshold, or it will be more negative and it will be hyperpolarized, and that's further away from threshold because negative 90 millivolts now is further away from negative 55 millivolts right over here, which is our threshold potential. Now we're going to talk about, well, what's going to happen if our cell does reach threshold potential? In other words, if we look right over here and we actually get this region of the cell, this axon hillock right over here, to about our threshold of negative 55 millivolts, right? Remember, the cell starts off at negative 70 millivolts when it's not stimulated, right? And we can actually make this negative 70 millivolts, this region over here, right over here, a lot less negative by opening up some of these sodium channels. And if we open up some of these sodium channels, right, let me just draw some sodium channels right over here. Right, so maybe I'm gonna bind some ACH right over here, and eventually I'll activate some sodium channels, so it's an excitatory neurotransmitter. And if enough positively charged ions or cations come into this axon hillock region right over here, well, what do we have in this region? We actually have these voltage-gated sodium channels, and they happen to open up at negative 55 millivolts, right? Once they open at negative 55 millivolts, that's when we initiate the action potential. That's right. So now we're going to talk about this part. We're going to talk about what actually happens when we trigger an action potential. So we're going to come down to this graph, all right, and I'm just going to redraw the neuron right over here. And I'm not going to draw the myelin sheath just for simplicity. So if we look at this neuron, these are the dendrites. This here is the cell body, and our root word for body is called soma, right? Hence, somatocytes happen to be, somatic cells happen to be cells for our body, such as our skin cells, as opposed to germ cells, which are not for our body. All right, so if we look over here, let's say this region does reach negative 55 millivolts. Now we're going to activate voltage-gated channels, right? Because they open up based on charge. So what actually happens here? We actually have this region over here, right? And before we begin that, I want to show you how the cell actually looks. So naturally, right at this spot over here, right? I'm just going to clear this up a little. Right at this spot, right before the voltage-gated sodium channels open up, the cell looks like this. There's a lot more sodium on the outside of the cell. This is the outside of the cell. And there's a lot of potassium on the inside of the cell. Once that channel opens, that voltage-gated sodium channel, what do you think will happen? So let me just erase this and open up a voltage-gated sodium channel. And this here is occurring at the axon, right over here. It's occurring right over here. Right. What's going to happen? Well, sodium's going to rush into the cell. And if sodium's going to rush into the cell, sodium is positively charged. What do you think will happen to sodium? What do you think will happen to the inside of the cell? Will the inside of the cell become less negative or more negative? it's going to become less negative, right? Because you have positive charge going into the cell. Another way of saying that is that the inside of the cell, right, that I'm going to highlight in yellow, is going in the positive direction. So if there's positively charged ions going into the cell will go in the positive direction. Hence, it's going to be less positive, so we call that depolarization. And all the sodium is going to flow into the cell, and at about positive 40 millivolts, our cell now looks like this. We have a lot of sodium on the inside and a lot of potassium on the inside as well. What's going to happen next? At about positive 40, we actually activate another set of channels. Not the actual voltage-gated sodium channels, right? Because at positive 40, the voltage-gated sodium channels will close. So I'm going to close this up. And at positive 40 millivolts, you have another channel at play. I'm going to draw that in purple. You actually have the opening of voltage-gated potassium channels. Notice I said voltage-gated because they open up based on charge. And which way will potassium flow? Since there's more potassium on the inside of the cell relative to the outside of the cell, potassium will flow out of the cell. And if potassium flows out of the cell is becoming negative again because we're losing positively charged ions, aka cations. We're losing the positive charge, and the cell's becoming negative again, so it's becoming negative again. Remember I told you that think of polar as negative? It's becoming negative again, so it's undergoing repolarization. So all that potassium is flowing out of the cell. So much to a point that it's going to be super duper negative. It's going to actually hyperpolarize. This region is hyperpolarization. It's going to become even more negative. It's going to become more negative than the actual resting membrane potential of negative 70 millivolts. Right? And at this point, the cell should look like this. Right? There's a lot of sodium on the inside of the cell relative to the outside of the cell, and there's a lot more potassium on the outside of the cell relative to the inside of the cell. And the question is, well, didn't we start off like this, where there's a lot of sodium on the outside of the cell, and there's a lot of potassium on the inside of the cell relative to the outside of the cell? And I'm going to say, yes, we did. So we have to fix this, right? The cell is way too negative. It's at negative 90 millivolts. So that's an issue. And B, the ions are switched, right? So how do we actually fix this? How do we actually get the cell back up to resting membrane potential? Let me give you a different color. How do we get back up to this region? Well, we do have some pumps that utilize ATP on our cells too. These are pumps, so they utilize ATP, and what they do is they pump 3 sodiums out of the cell for every 2 potassiums that go into the cell. Right, so I'm going to pump 3 sodiums out, 2 potassiums in. And eventually, the cell resting membrane potential gets restored. And also, there's a lot of potassium back into the cell, and there's a lot of sodium on the outside of the cell. So we're back at resting membrane potential, aka resting state. And that looks just like this part over here. And now the cell can undergo another action potential, that region.